hung on the wall of a museum, it's art. Quite simple. Don't have to deal with the question of beauty. We don't have to deal with the question of whether it's good or bad art. That's all it takes. But it's a little more to it than that, of course, because how does it get on the wall of a museum? And that's where it gets much more interesting from a sociological perspective. And so we would argue that all art is created in an art world of some kind. And that art world involves the production, the distribution, and the consumption of art. And typically, not surprisingly from a social perspective, that requires more than just an artist. It requires a community of people, often a very large community. The basic argument goes like this, that all art is socially constructed. A sociologist doesn't have a lot of time for the artist operating independent of any other context. He's always operating in a context. And so, for that reason, we get very interested in what that context is like. We spend less time on the artist and more on the context. That context legitimizes art. It's the context that will determine whether it's good art or not. And that's what gets to be sociologically interesting.
I wanted to talk about that idea of the context in which it's created, because Johan, you sort of focused on the question of what is art is easy, because if you intend it sort of to be art, then therefore it sort of becomes art, and then you decide whether it's good or bad, or good or less good, I guess is the phrase that you put it. But I wondered, Mandy, maybe if you wanted to comment, can something be artistic unintentionally? So I think of things like more commercial art, or architecture, things that have a different focus than aesthetics, but end up becoming to be seen as things that are beautiful, as things that are artistically and aesthetically and creatively interesting. So do you think art can be unintentional?
I think so. Having said that, I do think that the intention of the artist really informs the art. We were talking about the film that we're going to be seeing later, and there was some comparison between two different performance artists in the film, one being Marina. It seemed to me that the intention behind an artist, even if they're doing the same thing, i.e. in this respect, sitting still, the intention, whether that's to connect with people or whether that would be to not connect or to be thinking about what you are doing as a performance artist as opposed to how this is impacting. I think that's going to change the flavor of the art. I personally feel that art is, as opposed to a product, it's a process. It's actually, I think, this idea of a sociological perspective of how did it get on the wall. To me, I think that is where art lies, is in that transformation of intention into whatever it becomes. With documentary, there are many aspects of the art, but one of the key ones through storytelling is transformation. That there needs to be some kind of change affected through the story in order for that film really to have the key ingredients for a successful artful film. I think that idea of transformation and change, allowing this idea of something that you've always seen but never really noticed, or that you see in a new way, that to me is art, is allowing us to see something in a different way, through a different context, through a different perspective than we might ordinarily see it.
That's actually quite interesting, I think, because the focus on art as a process. Because in the last film we saw Andy Goldsworthy making these pieces that were essentially ephemeral, that would disappear very quickly after we made them. And it's interesting to me when we talk about what is art, when does that work that he created end up no longer becoming art as it disappears? So for example, that wooden structure, that whirlpool structure, as it ended up being carried out to sea and it fell apart, at what point in time was that no longer a piece of art? And similarly, we can sort of make these distinctions between various forms of art that are similar to things which are not considered art. So Pepita, the concept of documentary as an art form is somewhat similar to the concept of journalism and trying to tell the story and focusing on the truth, but still having elements of drama and elements of discovery, elements of transformation, as Mary said. At what point in time do we sort of find that transition from something that is educational and investigative to something that is documented and something that is artistic and creative?
I may not answer directly that particular question, but I'll do it in a roundabout way, which is that I've made a few documentaries on art, on different artists. And I found it really interesting in the course of my research for those films to learn about certain moments in time where there were these pivotal moments that were brought on usually by either a group of people or a particular artist that would even inspire revolt. And I'm thinking now of I think it was Verdi when of The Rite of Spring, which isn't Verdi at all. Yeah. And it literally created demonstrations in Paris when it came out, because people were just beside themselves. This isn't music, this is cacophony. I'm also thinking of moments such as the first exhibition of the Impressionists was brought into New York. I think it was in 1906, and none of the art world or the art aficionados in North America had really been exposed to that work yet, and they were all very distraught about this being art, and it makes me think of groups like the Bloomsbury Group. I don't know if you would have heard of them, but it was a very organic group of multidisciplinary artists, and it involved people like Virginia Woolf, and it was Clive Bell who was their main sort of inspiration. And again, he kind of turned the idea of what is art on its ear, because up until then, it was a very representational thing. And so it was always, if you're drawing a pear, then it's this pear that you see in front of you, but it's also the pear that you've seen painted by, all these other artists that came before you. And so your idea as an artist of what a pear looked like was more informed by the traditional idea of what a pear is, and as opposed to having your own notion, and expressing your own notion of what a pear looks like. And so this whole Bloomsbury group was very much about that, about really putting down or expressing your particular interpretation of something as opposed to what was the accepted version of it. And it also makes me think of other people like Isadora Duncan that completely broke the mold in the world of dance, or Martha Graham, for example, where these are people who depart from what is accepted up until that point as representing that particular art form or that idea of a painting. And they just question it, and they throw it out there, and yes, it creates discomfort, but it also triggers a whole other approach. So that's my long, convoluted answer.
That's good. I think the idea of challenging the consensus, and obviously at the beginning it may or may not be accepted, but I think it's funny that you talked about the Impressionists, because Monet's work, Impression and Sunrise, is where we get the definition or the term Impressionism, and it was used by an art critic mockingly, actually, that called them the Impressionists. And now we see Impressionism as sort of this idea of the established art world now, and as most people, when they go to an art museum, they think of the Impressionists as what they should go see, because that's what art is supposed to be. So I think it's funny how something that is subversive ends up becoming the mainstream as a result. Johan, you talked about how what is art is not the question, but what is good art and what is less good art is sort of what we want to focus on. Obviously, these pieces that we do now see as good or high quality or art that should be paid attention to, at first is dismissed, or at first is considered not worthy of attention. Is it possible to define for a universal definition of what is good art, or is that something that changes over time, and how do those pieces of art that are at first seen as ugly or disgusting end up becoming masterpieces?
I don't think there'll ever be a definitive definition of art. It's been debated by the Greeks, the Romans, and people for thousands of years. I think if one looks at art through the past centuries, one of the elements that stands out is the conviction that an artist brings to it, the amount of effort, intensity, input, and yeah, obviously talent. But I think it has to do with conviction. Art, like documentary movie making, like music, like ballet, writing, it's, to a degree, it's all storytelling. And it has to do with how effectively you tell a story, how effectively you transport the viewer or the person involved in it, how effectively you transport them to a level of emotional quality or surprise or excitement. But you need Goldsworthy brings that. The stuff he does is incredibly simple, but what he brings is a level of intensity and focus that convinces us. You need that conviction. And you need to be able to transport people. You need to grip people and shake them emotionally, physically, or whichever way. And I think that's what brings it. Whether you're making a film or writing a book or dancing or playing an instrument, that is what you bring, and that is what I think is a very vital element.
Jerry, from the sociological perspective of those sort of power structures that allow a piece of art to go from something that is seen as worthless to something that's seen as a masterpiece, are there qualities to these pieces of art that end up being able to get their way onto the wall of a museum? Is it that emotional aspect that Johan talks about?
I think it's a very complex process. You can imagine certain factors that would influence that. A patron, for example. And a patron may or may not like the art. But the patron puts something on the wall, the patron goes on the wall also. The other feature to it is again, Johan is talking about this, is persistence. We know that the craft of any art form requires an enormous amount of practice. And if you're not prepared to do that, then you probably won't hone your craft, and therefore you won't produce a work of art. I think I would still argue that it does require a legitimation somewhere along that line, and that legitimation can occur in a number of forms, not just hanging on the wall. One of the forms that we see today with social media is going viral. And I have a bit of trouble with that. Is that legitimation? Does that legitimize a piece of art? In some respects, it does, because it brings a credibility, deserved or otherwise, depending on your point of view. It does bring a sense of credibility to the creator of that art and the artwork itself.
Peter, I'm going to ask the last question to you before we go to our lovely folks here in the audience. We talked a lot about the intent of the artist and how the community responds to that intent and the creative process. But I was wondering, can something be art without an artist?
Well, I think it calls to mind the famous saying, art is in the eye of the beholder, right? So it does sort of say that anything that a person perceives as art then becomes art. Then it is almost a question of the perception of each of us. It can happen just in the flash of a second when you're walking down the street and you see the juxtaposition of, I don't know, like we were looking out the window earlier, the red leaves against intense blue sky, and it was like, wow, that's art. But we wouldn't have recognized it, we were two people and we were both thinking that. So perhaps it's more the engagement of the human with the object, or it can be also people moving in space. A dancer like Margie Gillis, I don't know if you know her, but she's a famous Canadian dancer because she was the first modern dancer invited to perform in China. there are people I know in the dance world who look at what Margie does as dance and they don't consider what she does dance because it doesn't fall within the understood or accepted, generally accepted classical traditional notion of dance, because it's very Margie and it's very expressive. So that again it's a very, you could almost say it's a personal question. What is art? It really is. It's you that decides ultimately.
What role do you think passion has in art? And passion, of course, means suffering.
Maybe Johan, do you want to comment on, have you had to suffer a lot in terms of the artwork that you make?
No, I don't suffer. I get paid vast amounts of money to chocolate all day. Suffering is a myth. I think the idea of passion is what I was saying. It's conviction. You need passion to have a conviction. And what you're saying about a bare piece of canvas or paper, there's charlatans everywhere. And one of the biggest at the moment is a gentleman called Jeff Koons. Certainly you can, and Damien Hirst, you can encrust a platinum skull with millions of dollars of diamonds. Is it art? Yeah, it is. But is it worth pursuing? Does it have content? That's my question. It's there are people who make wine at home, and technically it's wine, but heaven forbid I drink it.
I would like to add that because to add to what you were saying, because I think a lot of producing anything, any art form entails you being alone with yourself. And I suppose then, there are those moments when you could call it suffering, but it's more that there's an intensity to how you have to live in order to be able to, manifest what it is that you're doing as an artist.
If you speak about suffering in art, Van Gogh would have been a prime example. He suffered a great deal. He suffered for different reasons, but his art is an exaltation. His art isn't about suffering, and I think a lot of artists find some kind of joy. Well, I hope so. Find joy in what they're making. Many artists suffer for their craft. Ballet dancers destroy their feet over time and have to live with chronic pain. I know painters who have struggled with toxicity problems, paints that they've used. All of those things. If you're a cyclist, you're going to fall off the bicycle and break bones. There's a certain amount of suffering, and I think that it's a romantic notion that artists have to suffer. I think some artists are just, they just like suffering.
It's interesting, there's a certain level of masochism in some of the art, and Marina Abramovich's work, she induces suffering in herself to create a reaction in the audience. So you'll see that, I think, later today. But I also think there's a focus not on suffering as part of the creative process, but how people who just simply have suffered in their life end up using that or having something creative come out of that, not as a forced sense of suffering. We saw it is odd how some of the greatest artists, or people that we think of the greatest artists, have endured some element of suffering in their lives, either the suffering that they cause or endure as part of their work, or suffering that they endure as part of the rest of their life that gives them a certain sort of emotion and creative energy.
It strikes me that in order to really follow your bliss, sometimes you really have to sort of break the shackles of who you should be according to either people outside of you or within yourself. And that can, in itself, cause suffering of a kind, because you're actually having to sort of, break expectation and really have that intensity to follow who you truly are. Because it seems to me that good art comes from deep within, and an understanding of that relationship of who you are to the external world. And And that's not always easy to do. And some people, I think, some artists, don't even have a choice. And it just seems to me that that can also cause suffering, is that drive to express yourself in a particular way that doesn't necessarily resonate with the world around you or your circumstances or your financial situation. And, but I think passion is necessary for art to truly emanate.
I think artists, by and large, are people who want to experience things at a certain intensity. They want to feel a certain high level of whatever feeling it is they are searching for. Whether they're going to be diving out of an aeroplane as a skydiver or subjecting themselves to some kind of pressure, that's what they're looking for. And they find it in their art. When you are painting something, as Goldsworthy does, he's stacking those stones, the tension, the stress, the commitment and the complete involvement in making that is what makes that so compelling. If he was just putting pieces of polystyrene sort of vaguely on top of each other, we wouldn't be watching that. But we're drawn into that action. We know it's going to fall. And we want to see him prick his finger and bleed, and we want to see him fall over, we want to see these things collapse. We are drawn to that intensity of something. And we want to see it in a work of art, we want to see it in a movie. We don't want to watch a documentary about somebody sitting writing for hours at a time. It's boring. We want to see the artist publish the work. We want to see people crying when they read it. We want to see people dancing and bringing all they have to play. That is what we're drawn to. That is essentially what art is. So the passion, the pain, all that is part of it.
I was thinking about a book that made a huge impression on me, and the title of the book was Will and Power. And the part of it that really resonated with me was the idea that we all have this creative energy in us, and it's sort of like the extent to which you decide individually to express it or not that kind of determines whether you are an artist or not. And I use that term in a very formal sense. But the part I found very interesting was the idea that he was saying that if you do not express that creative energy that we have within yourself, in some way, it turns back on you and you become, not narcissistic, but neurotic, thank you, it was an N-word. And I really identified very strongly with that because I recognized in myself that I was going through a period in my life at that point where I was stuck, and I was kind of in this vicious circle of not getting whatever it was at that point that had to manifest itself. And that really for me was like a huge relief to find out that if I could just sort of open the window or door and let some of this come out, pouring out, that I would stop kind of turning back on myself and almost, becoming self-destructive in some ways,
I found what you said very interesting because it made me think of the artistic process. Because in the artistic process, you're expressing yourself. And you're not necessarily, as the point that you were making, looking at the end product always. Sometimes you're just expressing yourself and allowing yourself that freedom of self-discovery. And then the product gets named as art at the end, and you put a frame around it, put it on a stand, or create a show, but the actual artistic expression is the process.
You're going to change the topic?
Only if I'm permitted to do so. Not that big a change. It's quite properly, we've been focusing primarily on the artist when we try and answer the question, what is art? And we talked a lot about that. I don't think we should forget, though, that art is extraordinarily powerful as a social force. And that's my bias, obviously, both for good and for evil. And we need to keep that in mind from time to time because once in a while we need to resist. We know, for example, that art is a vehicle for actually increasing social inequality. We don't usually associate the two, but the whole question of, as Bourdieu pointed out some years ago, of cultural capital and how powerful cultural capital is in achieving status and power in societies generally. A lot of that stems from the art world and the extent to which you can use your knowledge of art, your possessions of art, objects, as a device to increase your own social status. And we all know that examples of that all over. So you create a kind of distinction among those persons who are well versed in art, possess art, and are patrons of art. Some years ago I did some research on art boards across the major art organizations in Canada. And I was looking for networks, and they're certainly there. So there are economic and business networks that are spawned by the art world itself, which really represents a powerful force in society which people don't see on a day-to-day basis. The political use of art, of course, has been around for so long. Propaganda comes to mind, and that gets us back to documentaries pretty quickly when we consider the use of the documentary for propaganda purposes. But there's another aspect of that I think we should keep in mind, and that is art, and I would say particularly popular art, serves as a wonderful diversion for large segments of the population. So if you can keep people occupied by gluing their eyes to a screen, they're not likely to be thinking about some of the real situations, real concerns that they have, whether it's the destruction of the earth or whether it's the local community not looking after its poor. So there's a diversionary function here that we shouldn't lose sight of. And there's certain ideologies that can be perpetuated through art, of course. Recall the Prime Minister made the decision that we're going to replace works of Canadian art that are hung in embassies around the world. We're going to replace those with an image of the Queen. Now, what's going on here? You know, you can answer that question, I'm sure. So there's a real political force behind the arts in ways that we sometimes don't pay a lot of attention to. The whole question of the economics, of course, is another one, but that's pretty obvious about the distribution of wealth, and particularly in the art worlds, and how uneven that tends to be. Most artists, indeed, still struggle.
Actually, it's interesting you brought up the idea of the morality of some forms of art, and I was wondering, Johan, if you wanted to comment on is the morality of a work of art and how it becomes associated with a type of morality, does that detract from whether or not it's good? If there is a suffering to, I don't know, an animal as a result of a creation of a work of art, or if when I think of Wagner's operas and how they became associated with Nazi Germany and the propaganda used there, does that, a lot of people will refuse to listen to Wagner, even though in many ways it's seen as incredibly valuable and incredibly artistic works. People won't listen because of the association that they have. So I was wondering, do you think that something could be effectively evil art, but still be good art?
I think there is a certain the possibilities about the morality of art. If art is created from the artist's intention to make a piece, I think that's fine. Yes, I mean, you'll always find some immoral aspect about it, from torturing an animal or a person to make your art if it's not yourself. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's no question about it. That poor Wagner had to be dragged into Hitler's nightmare. I think it's a pity for Wagner. I don't think he wrote it for Hitler. I don't think he wrote it with that intention. I think Hitler and his party co-opted it and turned it into part of his propaganda, which was unfortunate. It doesn't reflect in any way on Wagner's work. The morality problem I do have with certain kinds of art is when it's publicly public art and it's being commissioned to promote a certain propagandist idea. Yeah, it's rotten from the start. Coming from South Africa, I saw artists commissioned to make big public works of art, deifying people who had done questionable things. Obviously. But the moment that happens is it is no longer pure art, it is art in the service of something else. Very much like the advertising business or commercial art. Just look at what the current condition of music is, and popular music, where if it's not Britney Spears or Lady Gaga trying to do something, outdo each other, it's about selling records, it's pornography. Pornography is also a form of art, but we question morality. You cannot throw it out and say it's not art because it was made with an intent. Apparently they do look at camera angles. It's not the question is not is it art, it's just is it healthy or not?
I would just like to add to that, because I was thinking about Miley Cyrus, and the very questionable morality of her recent performance. And what has surprised and delighted me in some ways is the response that is emerging from that. The parodies, the expression of either disdain, disgust, or the defenses of her work. There's some very interesting memes that it is throwing up, and that people are sort of riffing off and sort of parodying. I think that there's a way in which not necessarily that what Miley Cyrus did is art, and maybe it is, I don't know, I don't consider it so, but I think that it's possible to see that some of the response to that is art.
Question morality. Again, there are so many examples of the forces of society impacting upon art and determining the direction of art. The major Corcoran Gallery in Washington, you recall, a few years ago, was forced to shut down the Cyrano exhibition. You remember this Piss Christ thing was just outrageous in the eyes of so many. So the gallery was forced to lose its independence, which the whole art world cherishes so much, but they were forced into having to shut that down. How about a local example? We had, for a short time, the baggage handler, if you recall, in the roundabout by the art gallery, and that got shut down, I presume on moral grounds. And in my judgment, that's a tragedy, because this town needs an icon or two, and that would have been a wonderful one, particularly when we got publicity right through the New York Times.
I think a lot of the films from this weekend, there is a sense of spirituality, and certainly in Andy Goldsworthy's work, spirituality is an important part. He focuses a lot on that connection with nature, and which is not necessarily something that everyone shares. Some people look at it as, well, this is mysticism and a bunch of hooey, right? Whereas some might say that no, this is an integral part of their artwork, that this is how they get into that creative sort of charismatic space. And I think you'll see that with the second film we're going to watch today. But do you think that the connection with, or a sense of spirituality and the connection with something more than just the material is important for us to create good art or art at all? Do you think that's important?
I don't know if everyone would call it spirituality, but I do think that it's very much about humanity and about our humanness. there's that common thread running through all of the films that we're watching this weekend. In the case of Andy Goldsworthy, it's very manifested through his his own connection to nature that draws us into his understanding, his connection to nature. And that is, just by our circumstance, that is a very important, significant part of being human. The next film about Marina Abramovich, even though she's doing some pretty outlandish things, the heart of what she's doing is really about being human and connecting as human beings, and how to create those moments that will allow us to make that contact. Because we live in a world where contact is not encouraged. It's not something that is nurtured in our everyday life. It's something that, if anything, we're rushing around trying to avoid. These are all examples of how it's, at the end of the day, whether you want to call it art or what, it's about being human.
All right, on that note, even though we might have a tremendous compulsion to keep talking, I think we do need to have a bit of a break here before our next film, which starts at 5. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming, and it was a very interesting discussion here on a Saturday afternoon, and I hope the rest of you come back for the next film at 5 o'clock, Marina Abramovich, The Artist is Present. It's a bit more, certainly an avant-garde film, and it's a bit shocking at times, so you should prepare yourselves for that. But it's a great, interesting film that really does touch on the question of what is art as well. So I hope you can come back to that at 5 o'clock.
What is so beautiful about the MoMA performance, she's treating actually every human being she is encountered with the same attention and same respect. That's pretty shocking.